So the Z rune in Elder Futhark is often given the reconstructed name of Algiz or something like that. And I used to think that was kind of dumb, but I've changed my mind and I now think that that might be a pretty accurate reconstruction. So this is what happened. I was reading this book here and the author mentions that the Norse descendant of the Z rune may have been called something like ælgiz, which means elk. And I thought that was very strange because I've only ever heard this rune be called because that's what the manuscripts and whatnot call it. So I went to the internet to ask if anyone could explain this to me. So this guy replies to me, this herpaderp merkermerk guy, and he says that the reason why people say that, the reason why people think that the Norse rune may have been called ælgiz or whatever by some people in Scandinavia is because there are some rune stones like this one, and so on and so forth. There are some rune stones where the rune is making that sound. And it's a hard rule in runic that if a rune can make a sound, then it follows that the rune's name must contain that sound. So I looked up some of the rune stones herpaderp merkermerk mentioned, and sure enough you can find the this rune. You can find it not only being the it's not only doing its regular job as being that kind of Sengen R sound in the Norse language of the time, but also you can find it being a vowel in the range of a to e. So for example, in the word here, dreng, this rune is being used as that vowel. The same thing is going on here, and here, and here. And yeah, he gave other examples of runestones like this. Now, that wouldn't be the first time in the history of runes where a rune can make the sound which is at the beginning of its name, but also the sound at the end. For example, in English tradition, the rune ich could make either the e or the ch in its name. And here are some examples like the name Eaxel or something like that. Allmächtig. There are other examples too. I'm going to get back to the Norse stuff, but I want to say more on the English side of things and then tie that into the Norse stuff. So if you look at the English names of the runes, all of them are normal except one. So all of them are normal because they're singular, they're not inflected, they're things like thorn, torch. Two of them seem to have been named after gods, but those are still pretty regular nouns, even if they're proper nouns. Ice. Even the runes where we don't know what they meant exactly, it's still clear from their spellings and from the rune poem that they were still just regular things. Now the one exception to all of that is the English equivalent of the rune we're talking about, or rather the descendant. So this is the descendant of the Elder Futhark Z rune and the brother of the Norse, whatever rune you want to call this. And this is noteworthy because if this rune were not originally named elk, why would it have such a strange name? So imagine if this rune were originally named after something like boat. So that was its original name in Elder Futhark, let's say, boat. And let's say you want to repurpose the rune, because that seems to be what happened, because the, I'll get into that later, but the rune seems to have been repurposed as an X rune when it was previously a Z rune. Well, if you were going to come up with a name which is appropriate, why wouldn't you name it something like this word, which basically means short sword, axe, box, shoulder, head hair? There are all of these very normal words you could have picked. Instead, you went and you picked a word, elk, and it doesn't have an X sound in it, so then you made it possessive. And now, like, that is so weird. And the spelling doesn't even, by default, have an X in it. This spelling here in this manuscript is contrived, because you wouldn't normally spell it with an X. It's like the person went out of their way, and you can see the same thing in other manuscripts where they're going out of their way to insert an X into the spelling, even though it's not really there normally, just as in modern English, just as the word ælgiz isn't spelled like this, right? So the takeaway here is that maybe the reason why this rune, out of all the runes, has such a weird name is because it was originally named ælg, and then they wanted to repurpose it as an X rune, and so they're like, well, the simplest way to do that is just to keep the name but then make it possessive, because then it will have the desired sound. I should also point out that it kind of makes sense for this rune to be repurposed, because the old Z phoneme would be completely useless for English, because English didn't have a standalone Z sound. The only time Z shows up in Old English is as a variant of S, and Old English needed to mark that it was a Z sound just as much as we need to mark that the S in dogs is really a Z. And that is to say, we don't need to at all, because it's crystal clear from the context that it is a Z sound. And English got by perfectly fine and wouldn't have needed a Z rune if they even still remembered that it was originally a Z rune. So in English, they would have had this rune, and if they still remembered what sound it made, it would have been a pointless one. And if they didn't remember what sound it made, or if they attached a descendant sound of the Z sound, then they would have been remembering it, probably misremembering it as being an S rune, or possibly just an R rune, so a redundant rune all around. Possibly what could have happened is whatever its name originally was, the original name probably ended with a Z sound because that was the case ending, the nominative case ending. But because that whole case system, not the whole case system, but part of the case system dropped, and English no longer marked nominative nouns like that, the name of the rune would therefore have nothing to do with the sound it originally had, right? So if the name of the rune was originally something Z, well then after the Z gets dropped, then we're left with whatever the original name was without its case ending, and then this name probably had nothing to do with whatever sound the English associated with it, if they associated any sound with it. And so this is why it was such a tempting, I guess, rune to be repurposed, especially if you get into contact with the Latin alphabet and you see that they have an X and you think that's kind of cool. And you're like, well, we have this useless, bizarre rune laying around, so why don't we make it an X? This is where everything comes together. So the red text stands for stuff which is just speculation, and then the black is stuff which is more firm than that. So we have the English name of the rune being this weird contrived thing, which seems to have been contrived just so it would have the X sound in it. And so the implication or the hint we can get from that is that maybe it was originally called elk, and then they just made it possessive in order to get the desired result. And meanwhile, in some places in Scandinavia for a time, we can find the equivalent rune making a sound in the range of a to e, while also being the R sound, which it's normally associated with. And the implication from that, the very hard implication, is that the name of the rune began with either an A or an A and ended with that R sound. And then I'm inserting the LG here out of speculation. Meanwhile, also in Scandinavian tradition, the rune is called or named ælgiz, or I don't know how you would pronounce this, but it's given this name in many manuscripts, many Norse manuscripts, and we can see from the context that it had these sounds at various times in this context. Now I might have something of an explanation for this complication down here, because I would prefer if this weren't real, if this weren't true, because then that would simplify everything. Okay, so first of all, and this doesn't have necessarily anything to do with what I'm talking about, I just thought it was suspicious or interesting. If you lay out the Elder Futhark rune row next to the Younger Futhark rune row, all of the Younger Futhark runes are in their usual position relative to each other, except for the rune in question, the rune which this video is about. It is put all the way at the end for some reason. As I said, that probably has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. But anyways, what is relevant is that the name given to this rune in manuscripts is apparently, or at least some believe, it is a continuation of this rune, which I already talked about in this video. In the English tradition, this rune means yew, like yew tree, and it is named ælg, or ich rather, or both. It had both names, depending on accent or whatever. And in the Norse tradition, or at least the Norse tradition which made it into manuscripts, the rune has the same name, or at least the equivalent, the Norse equivalent of the word yew, apparently. Because the rune poems, the Icelandic and the Norwegian rune poems, I think both of them agree that it refers to bows made out of yew. I'll double check that later. Yeah, so my thinking is that maybe the rune really was originally named something like ælg, and it originally had the usage of being sounds in this range. So it would have these sounds because those were at the beginning of the name, but it could also have this sound because that was at the end of the name. And maybe some group of Norsemen wanted a rune for the sound, which this name, the ælg name, couldn't provide. And so maybe they repurposed it, either by giving it the defunct name of this rune, if they even still remembered what its name was, or maybe it's just coincidence that they ended up calling it the equivalent of the word yew. But whatever case, maybe this could explain why this name shows up at all, the yew name. So to wrap up this long and mumbly video, I'm going to go over everything again. Okay, so this usage I'm kind of just ignoring because I'm going to assume that this is an innovation that happened later. Okay, so the English name for the rune seems to be a contrived modification of the original ælg. I'm assuming it was originally called ælg because of how contrived this all is. Norse tradition, ignoring this tradition, in Norse tradition you can find the rune having the sounds which imply very strongly that its name began with either an a or an a and then ended with this weird r sound, and that this is what the Norse equivalent of the word ælg would be. And so putting everything together, that makes it not too unlikely that the Elder Futhark name of the rune really was originally something like ælgiz.